pirates were not bad people. They contributed a lot to our society, just like the Romans did. That's probably not a sentence you ever expected to hear, because most of us grew up with one idea, that pirates were pure evil. The villains in every movie, lawless and greedy, living only for gold and violence. Well, except for Pirates of the Caribbean, which at least tried to make them charming misfits instead of outright monsters. But what if I told you that the men, and sometimes women, flying the black flag were in some ways more democratic than the world's so-called civilized empires? Sounds weird, right? After all, ships full of supposed criminals hardly sound like the pioneers of the world's first floating democracy. And that's kind of where the problem is. We need to bust the myth about pirates. So what's the pirate stereotype we all grew up with? The eye patch, the parrot, the rotten-toothed villain who will betray anyone for a chest of gold. But if you look beneath the cliches, you'll find something that looks a lot more like a union meeting than a den of thieves. Yes, that's right. The real pirates who sailed in the so-called Golden Age of Piracy in the late 1600s and early 1700s were anything but the stereotype. On a pirate ship, everyone had a voice. No matter if they were born free or escaped from slavery, no matter if they spoke English, Spanish, African languages, or none at all, everyone had a say. And that means every big decision, from who to attack to how to split the loot, was put to a vote. Captains didn't rule by fear. Instead, they ruled by consent, and if they lost the confidence of the crew, they could be, and often were, voted out on the spot. Here is a real-life example. In 1718, Captain Charles Vane, a man whose very name sent chills through merchant sailors, was thrown out of power by his own men. Why? Not for being cruel, but for being too cautious. The crew thought he'd lost his nerve, and with a show of hands, they voted in a new captain, Calico Jack Rackham. Imagine that! A workplace where your boss can be sacked instantly, not by the owners, but by the workers themselves. And if that ain't democracy, I don't know what is. This wasn't a rare event either. Pirate captains had limited authority, usually only in battle or emergencies. The real day-to-day power was held by the quartermaster, an elected officer who acted as a sort of check and balance, making sure the captain didn't overstep or hoard too much gold for himself. The Romans gave us the idea of checks and balances, at least in theory, but on pirate ships, these ideas were being lived out every day by people who'd never set foot in a senate. Yet their democracy was as structured as that of Rome's. You'll see that if you just dig a little deeper into their Articles of Agreement. Wait, what's that? Well, it's the pirate constitution, written out before every voyage, and it covered everything, starting from how loot was to be divided, how injuries were compensated, how arguments were settled, even rules about gambling and lights out at night. Think about this for a second. Most people in Europe or America at the time had almost no rights. Kings ruled by divine decree. Ordinary sailors in the navy or merchant ships were treated like disposable tools. They were underfed, flogged, worked to the bone, and paid next to nothing. But aboard a pirate ship, there was equality, transparency, and mutual aid. Lose an arm in a fight? You wouldn't starve, you would get a payout that could set you up for life. This leads us to the elephant in the room. Why would a bunch of villains care so much about fairness, justice, and crew welfare? Part of the answer lies in who pirates really were. Many were former Navy men, sick of abuse and starvation. Others were escaped slaves or workers run off from plantations and ships looking for a better deal, a more dignified life. On a pirate ship, you were judged by how you pulled your weight, not by where you came from or the color of your skin. Some ships were up to 30% black. In a world where slavery was the norm, pirates offered an alternative, freedom, and an equal share. Historians even found that some pirate ships elected black men as quartermasters or captains, a revolutionary idea in an era when most countries treated black people as property. But don't get me wrong, this wasn't paradise. pirates could be ruthless to outsiders. They did commit violence and theft. The system worked because every man on board knew he was just one vote away from losing everything or gaining more than he ever dreamed. So how did this radical democracy develop? It came out of necessity. On a cramped, dangerous ship, trust and cooperation was everything. You needed everyone's buy-in because any day could be your last. Rules weren't just ideals, they were survival tactics. If a captain lost the crew's trust, the whole ship could fall apart. That's why pirates invented systems that made sure no one man could become a tyrant. Now, here's the twist. If you fast forward a century or two, you'll see the same ideas popping up in the birth of modern democracy. Written constitutions, elected leaders, checks and balances, equal votes. But in our history books, we always give the credit to Rome, Athens, or maybe even America's founding fathers. Yet we forget the pirates. The question is, why? Here's a theory. Pirates threatened the status quo. They lived outside the law, challenged imperial power, and proved that ordinary people, no matter their background, could run their own affairs. That's a dangerous message if you're a king or a merchant prince. So, over time, the story of pirate democracy was buried under legends of buried treasure and plank walking. But the evidence is there, if you look for it. Okay, maybe you're thinking, so what? Why should we care if pirates voted for their captains, or split loot equally, or wrote their own rules 200 years ago? Here's why it matters. History shapes how we see the world and ourselves. If we ignore stories like pirate democracy, we forget that real change often comes from outsiders, not just the powerful. In times when we still struggle with inequality and exclusion, remembering these lost examples reminds us that fairness and bold ideas can start anywhere, even on the fringes. So when someone says democracy belongs only to kings or parliaments, remember the pirate crews who made it real. Together, on open water. Their story is still a lesson for us today. So what do you think? Do pirates deserve their spot in the uptown of history? Let us know in the comments. Subscribe for more stories that turn history upside down, and I'll see you in the next one.